Zuri Carter was used to being invisible. In the bustling streets where tourists laughed over expensive meals, she weaved unnoticed, selling flowers just to survive. No one truly saw her. Not the rich men in tailored suits, not the elegant women who barely spared her a glance, and certainly not William Harrington, the powerful businessman who sometimes bought a rose out of habit, never once looking at the child handing it to him. But everything changed the night she stepped into his world. She shouldn't have been inside that restaurant. She shouldn't have seen what she saw. But when a waiter switched Harrington's glass for another, when his hands trembled just slightly, something in Zuri told her to pay attention. And when Harrington lifted that poisoned glass to his lips, she didn't think. She acted. Now she's not invisible anymore. Now she's the only witness to a crime bigger than she could have ever imagined. But what happens when the people responsible realize she knows too much? Stay until the end, because once the truth comes out, there's no turning back. Tell us, where are you watching from? And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that will leave you on the edge of your seat. William Harrington barely glanced at the little girl who stood near his table, her small hands clutching a bundle of fresh flowers. He had seen her before, on countless nights, weaving through the tables of this same luxurious restaurant, offering delicate blooms to well-dressed diners. Sometimes, out of politeness or habit, he would hand her a few bills, taking a flower without even looking at her. Tonight should have been no different. The soft murmur of laughter and the clinking of glasses filled the grand dining hall. But Zuri Carter was not focused on the usual sights and sounds. Her dark eyes, sharp and watchful, locked onto the waiter near William's table. She had seen him a few times before, but something was different tonight. The way his fingers tightened around the stem of a wine glass, the slight hesitation in his movements, the subtle exchange, one glass for another. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but Zuri caught it. Her heartbeat quickened. She knew what deception looked like. Living on the streets, even as a child, had trained her to notice things others overlooked. And right now, something was very wrong. She stepped closer, her bare feet making no sound. Against the polished floor, the waiter turned away swiftly, vanishing into the sea of guests, his task completed. William, oblivious, reached for the glass now before him. Zuri's fingers tightened around her flowers. A dozen thoughts raced through her mind. Was it poison? Was it some kind of trick? Should she say something? But who would listen to a girl like her? No one ever did. She looked around, searching for anyone who might have noticed what she had just seen. But the room buzzed with idle chatter and clinking silverware. No one was paying attention. Her stomach twisted. She had to act. She didn't know why, but the feeling in her gut screamed at her to stop him. Zuri took a shaky breath and darted forward, her small frame slipping between chairs and legs, unnoticed until it was too late. Just as William lifted his glass, she lunged, knocking it from his hand with a force that sent the deep red liquid flying through the air. Gasps erupted from nearby tables. The glass shattered against the marble floor, the wine spreading in an uneven stain. But then, something shocking happened. Where the liquid touched the carpet, an eerie sizzle filled the air. The expensive fabric blackened, curling at the edges as if being burned. Zuri's breath caught in her throat. Her hands trembled, her flowers scattered at her feet. Forgotten. The realization hit her like a blow. She had been right. Something had been in that wine. She turned to look at William, who was staring at the ruined carpet, his face shifting from confusion to something darker. He understood too. For the first time, his piercing blue eyes met hers, truly seeing her. The room had gone eerily silent. Guests exchanged puzzled glances, whispering among themselves, but no one else seemed to understand the gravity of what had just happened. The waiter was gone. William's fingers twitched, as if debating whether to speak or keep his thoughts to himself. Zuri took a step back, her instincts screaming at her to run, but she couldn't. Not yet. Not until she knew what this meant. Her eyes darted toward the doorway, scanning for the mysterious waiter. Whoever he was, he had vanished too quickly, as if he had never been there at all. William turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice low, measured. The weight of his words sent a chill down her spine. Zuri hesitated, knowing that whatever she said next could change everything. "I just sell flowers," she murmured, barely above a whisper. It was the truth, but it felt like a lie now. She had stepped into something much bigger than herself, and she had no idea what would come next. William's gaze lingered on her, his mind clearly working through the implications of what had just happened. Then, without another word, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and placed it in her small hand. "Leave," he said. "Now." His tone was not unkind, but it left no room for argument. Zuri's fingers curled around the money, her heart pounding. She should listen to him. She should take the money, turn around, and disappear into the city like she always did. But she didn't move. She couldn't. She had too many questions. Who had tried to poison him? Why? And if she had seen it happen, had anyone else noticed her? Before she could make a decision, the sound of hurried footsteps caught her attention. Security. Men in dark suits were making their way toward them, their expressions unreadable but their intent clear. She had been seen. She was in trouble. Fear gripped her chest, but she fought against it. She had survived worse. Without another word, she turned on her heel and bolted, weaving through the restaurant past shocked diners and confused staff. She heard William say something, maybe calling after her, maybe ordering the guards to let her go. She didn't stop to find out. She pushed through the heavy doors, bursting into the cool night air, her heart hammering against her ribs. The streets welcomed her like an old friend. She ran until her lungs burned, ducking into an alleyway, pressing her back against the rough brick wall. She clutched the money in her hand, her pulse thundering in her ears. What had she just done? What had she just uncovered? Her mind raced with possibilities, but one thing was clear. Someone had tried to kill William Harrington tonight, and now she was the only witness. The grip on Zuri's arm tightened as the security guard dragged her toward the back of the restaurant. The chatter of the guests grew into a wave of confusion and fear. People pointed at the stain on the carpet, whispering among themselves. Waiters hesitated, unsure whether to keep serving or flee. From the unfolding chaos, a woman gasped audibly when she noticed the blackened, corroded patch on the floor where the spilled wine had burned through the expensive fabric. Was it poison? Someone murmured. "Who would do this?" Another asked in a hushed but urgent voice. Zuri's heart pounded as she squirmed in the security guard's grasp. "Let me go! I didn't do anything!" she protested, her voice small but filled with panic. No one listened. The tall, broad-shouldered man hauling her away didn't even flinch. She looked toward William Harrington, hoping for some kind of intervention, but he remained seated, fingers resting on the table, staring at the empty space where his glass had been moments ago. He was putting the pieces together, realizing just how close he had come to death. A second security guard knelt beside the ruined carpet, pulling a small device from his pocket. The room hushed slightly as he pressed a testing strip into the wet patch. All eyes turned to him. The seconds stretched unbearably long until the strip changed color. Green. A sharp breath was drawn somewhere in the crowd. "Poison," the guard announced, standing abruptly. The single word sent a ripple of renewed panic through the guests. People pulled away from their tables, stepping back as if the very air had become toxic. A waiter clutched his tray so tightly his knuckles turned white. More security personnel emerged from the shadows, their movements swift, coordinated. William Harrington finally pushed back his chair, standing to his full height. His blue eyes locked onto Zuri's, cold and calculating. In that moment, she wasn't just a street kid selling flowers anymore. She was a witness. "Bring her," he ordered, his voice steady but firm. Zuri didn't fight back. She knew how to pick her battles. Struggling now wouldn't change anything. She kept her chin up as they led her through the luxurious dining hall, past the horrified stares of well-dressed patrons who gawked at her as if she were a criminal. Some of them clutched their jewelry as if afraid she might steal from them. Others looked on with quiet curiosity. The walk through the restaurant felt endless, but soon they pushed through a set of doors leading to a private lounge. The atmosphere here was different. No clinking silverware, no idle laughter, just deep, polished wood, rich leather chairs, and walls lined with expensive bottles of alcohol. The room smelled of old cigars and power. The security guard shoved her into a chair opposite William Harrington, who took a slow, deliberate seat across from her. He clasped his hands together, staring at her in silence. Zuri refused to cower under his gaze. "How did you know?" he finally asked. His voice wasn't angry, but there was a weight to it, a demand for truth. Zuri straightened in her chair. "I saw the waiter switch your glass," she answered, her tone unwavering. He hesitated. He looked nervous, but not in the way a new employee would be. He was waiting for something. When he handed you that glass, he was too careful, like he was making sure he got it right. Harrington listened intently. He was a man used to assessing people, to reading between the lines of what they said. "And after that?" he prompted. Zuri hesitated for only a second before continuing. "I watched him leave. He moved like he didn't want to be seen, like he was slipping into the background on purpose. Then he was just gone. I looked around, but no one else seemed to notice him." Harrington's fingers tapped slowly against the armrest of his chair. "You're saying no one else saw this man?" His voice was even, but there was something beneath it, frustration. He didn't like mysteries. He didn't like loose ends. Zuri nodded. "Only me." That fact alone changed everything. If no one else had noticed the waiter, it meant he was either a ghost, someone so skilled at blending in that people's eyes slid past him, or this was bigger than a simple poisoning attempt. It meant someone inside this restaurant had let him in. That realization darkened Harrington's already severe expression. His jaw clenched slightly as he exhaled through his nose. He wasn't just a man who had narrowly escaped death. He was a man who had enemies, and now he had questions. A sharp knock on the door interrupted them. One of the guards stepped in, his face set in a grim expression. "Sir," he said, directing his attention to Harrington, "we checked the cameras. The waiter, he's not in. The footage." Silence thickened in the room. Harrington's fingers curled slightly. Zuri's stomach flipped. That wasn't possible. She had seen him. She had watched him switch the glasses. But if there was no footage, if there was no trace of him, then that meant whoever had planned this had covered their tracks too well. It wasn't just a hired hit. It was something deeper, something planned to the last detail, and that meant whoever was behind this had connections. Harrington leaned back in his chair, studying Zuri again, but this time with a different kind of interest. "If I'm alive, right? And now," he said slowly, "it's because you saved me." He let the words settle between them before continuing. "But why? What do you want out of this?" Zuri lifted her chin slightly, her expression unreadable. "I don't want anything," she said. "I just saw something I wasn't supposed to." Harrington's lips pressed into a thin line. "And now, you're involved whether you want to be or not." The weight of his words settled on Zuri's shoulders, but she refused to flinch. "Then I guess I need to know who did this," she said simply. Harrington studied her for a long moment before nodding. "So do I." William Harrington's limousine moved through the dimly lit streets, its polished black exterior reflecting the scattered lights of the city. Inside, the silence between him and Zuri Carter was thick, weighted by a reality neither of them had fully processed yet. The plush leather seats, the faint scent of expensive cologne, the gleaming interior. It was a world entirely foreign to her. She sat stiffly, her small hands clenched into fists on her lap, her wide, dark eyes scanning everything, not with wonder but with wariness. Harrington, seated across from her, observed the girl with quiet curiosity. She had saved his life, yet she carried herself as if she expected to be discarded at any moment. She was used to being overlooked, used to slipping between the cracks. That much was obvious. He could see it in the way she positioned herself, ready to run if needed. He sighed, breaking the silence. "You don't trust me." It wasn't a question. Zuri's gaze snapped to him, and for the first time, she met his eyes directly. "Why should I?" Her voice was steady, devoid of the awe or intimidation most people felt in his presence. "Rich people don't do things for free. What do you want?" "From me?" Her bluntness caught him off guard. He let out a quiet chuckle, though there was no humor in it. "I brought you here because I owe you," he said simply. "You saved my life. That's not something I take lightly." Zuri tilted her head slightly, as if weighing his words. "So what?" she said. "I don't need anything from you." The sharpness in her tone was a defense mechanism, a shield honed by years of surviving on her own. She didn't trust easy gestures. Harrington leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Maybe not," he admitted, "but have you considered that saving my life might have consequences?" Her brows furrowed. She had thought about it, of course. The way that waiter had disappeared, the fact that no one else had seen him. Someone had planned this carefully, and she had interfered. "You think they'll come after me?" she asked, her voice quieter now, but not afraid. She wasn't naive. She knew that people with power didn't like loose ends. Harrington studied her carefully. "I don't take chances," he said, "and neither should you. If they realize you saw something, they might want to make sure you don't talk." The words sat heavy between them. Zuri swallowed, shifting in her seat. She didn't like this. She didn't like feeling trapped in a situation she didn't choose. "I can just go back to the orphanage," she muttered. "Nobody there cares what I saw. I'll keep my mouth shut." Harrington exhaled through his nose, his expression unreadable. "That's not how this works, kid," he said, his voice quieter now. "They won't just assume you'll stay quiet. People like that. They tie up loose ends." Zuri's fingers curled tighter against her lap. She had lived a tough life, but this was different. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about being hunted. Still, she refused to show weakness. "So what then?" she challenged. "I stay with you, in your big house with your fancy cars, eat rich people food and pretend I belong?" There was bitterness in her voice, not because she envied him, but because she hated feeling powerless. Harrington chuckled again, but this time there was amusement in his eyes. "Something tells me you wouldn't pretend to belong anywhere you don't want to," he remarked. His smirk faded quickly, replaced by something more serious. "But for now, yes, you stay with me, at least until we figure out who did this." Zuri crossed her arms. "And if I don't?" Harrington's expression darkened just slightly. "Then I can't guarantee you'll be safe." The truth of it settled in her stomach like a heavy stone. She hated this. She hated that he was right. But most of all, she hated that she didn't have a choice. She exhaled sharply and looked out the window as the car pulled through tall iron gates. The mansion was massive, bigger than anything she had ever seen in real life. A long driveway led up to the grand estate, its towering pillars and gleaming windows exuding wealth in a way that made her stomach twist. This wasn't her world. It never would be. As the car stopped, a man in a crisp black suit opened the door for them. Harrington stepped out first, waiting for Zuri to follow. She hesitated only a second before climbing out, her gaze sweeping over the immaculate property. "Welcome to my home," Harrington said, watching her reaction. Zuri barely spared him a glance. "I don't want to be here," she muttered. She didn't need luxury. She didn't need protection. She needed familiarity, and this wasn't it. Before she could stop herself, she blurted out, "You have enemies, don't you?" She turned to look at him, searching his face for an answer. Harrington smiled slightly, but there was no warmth in it. "More than you can imagine." His honesty sent a shiver down her spine. For the first time, she realized just how deep this went. This wasn't just some failed poisoning attempt. This was a war she'd stumbled into without knowing the rules. She faced him fully now, her expression unreadable. "If someone wants you dead," she said carefully, "what does that have to do with me?" Harrington's blue eyes held hers, unwavering. "Because now," he said, "you're the only witness, and that makes you a target." Harrington sat in his private study, his fingers pressing against his temple as he scanned the reports spread across his desk. The more he read, the more the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. But he didn't like what they revealed. His recent decision to block a major pharmaceutical deal had stirred more than just boardroom frustration. It had put him in someone's crosshairs. The deal involved a new drug, one that promised groundbreaking results. But his team had uncovered something disturbing. Buried in the reports were hidden trials, unethical experiments, and side effects severe enough to cripple or kill. The company behind it had tried to cover it up, eager to push the product into the market before regulatory bodies could interfere. When Harrington pulled his funding and threatened to expose them, the threats began. At first, they were subtle, warnings from investors, hushed conversations about how he was making enemies in the wrong circles. He hadn't taken them seriously, not until someone had tried to kill him. He leaned back, exhaling slowly, his eyes flicking toward the window. He had been in the industry long enough to know that power bred enemies, but this wasn't a corporate grudge. It was something deeper, something personal. He turned his attention back to the reports, flipping through names and transactions, searching for the one connection that would tie it all together. He had to know who was behind this before they made another move. His mind was still reeling when a knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. One of his security personnel stepped in, his face unreadable. "Sir, the girl is wandering the halls again," the man said. "We found her near your office." Harrington frowned. Zuri. Meanwhile, Zuri was already making her way back. Through the dimly lit corridors, her small hands clutching a crumpled piece of paper she'd managed to pull from the trash before the guard spotted her. She didn't understand everything she had read, but she knew one thing for certain. There was a name scribbled in the margins that sent a chill down her spine. Alistair Crown. She didn't know who he was, but judging by the urgency in the documents, he was important and dangerous. She moved quickly, her bare feet barely making a sound against the marble floors. She needed to tell Harrington before anyone caught her. She had spent years surviving on the streets, dodging danger, slipping past people unnoticed. She knew how to move in places where she didn't belong, and tonight she had seen something she wasn't supposed to. By the time she reached Harrington's study, she was breathless, but she didn't hesitate. She pushed the door, open without knocking, stepping inside before the guards could stop her. Harrington's head snapped up, irritation flashing across his features, but when he saw her face, the annoyance faded. There was something urgent in her eyes. "What is it?" he asked, his voice steady but sharp. Zuri held up the paper, smoothing it out before placing it on his desk. "I found this in your office," she said. "It was in the trash." Harrington's gaze dropped to the paper. His expression didn't change immediately, but she saw the shift in his posture, the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers twitched as he picked it up. "Where exactly did you find this?" he asked, his tone careful. Zuri crossed her arms. "I told you, in the trash. Someone tried to get rid of it." Harrington's eyes scanned the document, and then suddenly he went still. Zuri watched as his jaw tightened, as something dark flickered in his gaze. He exhaled slowly, pressing the paper flat against the desk. "Alistair Crown," he murmured almost to himself. The way he said the name sent a shiver down her spine. "Who is he?" she asked. Harrington didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned back, rubbing a hand over his face before finally meeting her gaze. "An old partner," he admitted, "and a dangerous man." Zuri's brow furrowed. "Dangerous how?" Harrington hesitated, but only for a second. "He doesn't lose," he said simply, "and he doesn't forgive." That was all she needed to hear. She wasn't an expert in business, but she knew enough about people to understand what that meant. She let the information settle before speaking again. "So he tried to kill you?" she asked, her voice steady. Harrington studied her for a moment before nodding. "It makes sense," he said. "I cut off his funding. He stood to lose billions. But more than that, I had proof that he was behind illegal drug testing. If I had exposed him, his empire would have crumbled. Zuri exhaled sharply. And now that I found this, does that mean I'm in trouble too? Harrington's gaze softened slightly, but there was no comfort in his answer. It means you were already in trouble, he said. You just didn't know it yet. She didn't like that answer. She didn't like any of this. But something in the way Harrington looked at her made her pause. He wasn't just worried about himself anymore. He was worried about her. He saw something in her, something beyond just a kid who had gotten involved in the wrong situation. He saw a survivor, someone who had lived in a world most people ignored. He didn't say it, but she could feel it in the way he studied her, in the way his mind was already working through the implications of what she had found. Finally, he spoke again, his voice quieter this time. You really read all this in just a few seconds? Zuri shrugged, feigning nonchalance. Life on the streets teaches you to pay attention, but they both knew it was more than that. She wasn't just observant, she was different. And now, because of it, she was part of something far bigger than she had ever imagined. The black car pulled up to the towering office building, its tinted windows reflecting the city's glow. William Harrington sat in the back seat, his fingers drumming lightly against his knee. His expression was unreadable, but Zuri, sitting beside him, could feel the tension in the air. She had seen this look before, not on men in suits, but on people in the streets right before a fight. A man calculating every possible move, preparing for the worst. She shifted in her seat, gripping the edge of her sweater as she watched the security guards stationed outside the building. You really think this guy's just going to confess? She asked. Harrington turned his head slightly, his gaze sharp. No, he admitted, but I think he'll say just enough to bury himself. Zuri exhaled, not entirely convinced. She wasn't used to this kind of power play, but she knew one thing. Alistair Crowne was dangerous, and men like him didn't go down without a fight. As soon as they stepped into the grand marble lobby, two of Crowne's men were waiting for them. Dressed in dark suits, their presence was anything but professional. One of them motioned for Harrington to follow. Mr. Crowne is expecting you, he said. Zuri caught the way his fingers twitched near his waist, where a gun was likely hidden. She swallowed hard, but kept her face neutral. Harrington didn't acknowledge the tension, didn't break stride as he walked toward the elevators. Zuri stayed close, her small frame nearly lost beside him. The ride up was silent, the weight of something unseen pressing down on her chest. When the doors slid open, they were led into an expansive office, sleek and modern, yet somehow lifeless. Alistair Crowne stood near a massive desk, a smug smile stretching across his face. William, he greeted. He, smoothly, his voice thick with amusement. You brought company, how charming. His gaze flicked briefly to Zuri, as if she were an insect barely worth noticing. Harrington didn't waste time with pleasantries. I know it was you, he said coldly. You tried to have me killed, and now I have enough. To ruin you. Crowne chuckled, shaking his head. Oh, William, you always were predictable. He gestured vaguely, and before either of them could react, the heavy doors behind them slammed shut. The two guards from the lobby stepped inside, flanking the room. Zuri's muscles tensed. It was a trap. Crowne leaned against his desk, exuding the confidence of a man who had already won. Did you really think you could walk in here and expose me without consequences? He asked. That I would let you destroy everything I built? His voice dripped with condescension, as if Harrington was nothing more than a foolish obstacle in his path. Zuri clenched her fists, her mind racing. If this went south, they wouldn't be leaving this room. Harrington remained calm, his posture unyielding. You think I came here without a plan? He countered. Crowne smirked, but before he could respond, Zuri moved. You flash. She lunged forward, catching one of the guards off guard. She was small, fast, and used to slipping through tight spaces. Before the man could react, she stomped hard on his foot and elbowed his ribs, making him stumble back just enough for her to snatch the phone from Crowne's desk. The moment it was in her hands, she pressed record. Confess, she hissed, holding the phone up. Go ahead, tell us everything. Crown's face twisted in shock, then fury. You little... He lunged toward her, but Harrington stepped in front of her, his presence like a shield. Crown stopped short, his eyes narrowing. That phone won't leave this room, he growled. Zuri smirked. You sure about that? She tilted the screen, just enough for him to see the live feed. His own voice was being broadcasted. The police had been listening the entire time. Crown's expression faltered, his lips parting, slightly in realization. Then, as if on cue, the distant sound of heavy footsteps filled the hall outside. A second later, the doors burst open. Officers in tactical gear flooded the office, weapons drawn. Hands where we can see them, one of them barked. Crown's face twisted in fury as he was grabbed, his arms yanked behind him. His guards barely had time to react before they were taken down as well. Zuri stepped back, breathing heavily, her heart pounding against her ribs. The moment had happened so fast, but it had worked. She turned to see Crown glaring at her, his eyes burning with hatred. As the officer tightened the cuffs around his wrists, he leaned in just enough to mutter, I should have gotten rid of you along with him. The words sent a chill down Zuri's spine, but before she could respond, Harrington stepped between them, his voice as sharp as ice. But you didn't, he said. And now it's over. Zuri watched as Crown was hauled away, his once confident smirk replaced with seething rage. She exhaled, feeling the tension in her shoulders finally ease. It was over. They had won. She turned to Harrington, unsure of what came next. He studied her for a moment before sighing. You know, he said, most kids would have run away from this. Zuri shrugged. Most kids don't grow up the way I did. There was no sadness in her voice, just a simple fact. Harrington nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. Then, after a long pause, he said, Come on, kid, let's go home. Did this story touch you in any way? Share your thoughts with us in the comments. Your support means the world to us. Every video like this takes days to create, and knowing you're here motivates us to keep bringing you more special stories. So, if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the perfect time to join our community. Give this video a like, turn on the notifications, and keep exploring our other content. Thank you for being with us, and see you in the next one.